What's up, everyone? Welcome to our live stream. We are currently live on YouTube and on Rockfin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We have a very special live stream where I am joined by two very special guests, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges and political comedian Lee Camp. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Sure.
Thanks. Also, I want a telly. That's very important.
So we're gonna get right to it today. I'm not gonna do a super long intro. Everybody's talking about what's happening in Ukraine. We don't need to get into all the details because you both have, I know, a lot to say. And so I want to start off first by sharing an article from Chris Hedges, and we're going to discuss some points that you made in that article. But today, in general, we're going to be talking about the real reasons RT were shut down, the effects of U.S. sanctions that were recently slapped on Russia for its actions, military actions in Ukraine, and we're going to talk about, the censoring of anti-war voices, just this fog of war that has consumed us all and distorted the realities on the ground. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So I am going to share my screen here really quick. Chris, you recently published an article at SheerPost, which is called The Chronicles of a War Foretold. And it warns, well, I guess it doesn't warn, but it goes over how NATO expansion would provoke this kind of crisis in Ukraine. And I was really just amused by the first paragraph here. I'm going to read this out. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 reporting on the revolutions that overthrew the ossified communist dictatorships that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a time of hope. NATO, with the breakup of the Soviet Empire, became obsolete, and President Mikhail Gorbachev reached out to Washington and Europe to build a new security pact that would include Russia. Secretary of State James Baker in the Reagan administration, along with the West German Foreign Minister Hans Dietrich Genscher, probably pronouncing that incorrectly, assured the Soviet leader that if Germany was unified, NATO would not be extended beyond the new borders. So talk to us about, what happened after this point, because clearly NATO expanded eastward.
Right. So NATO was formed to prevent or build a kind of unified response between the United States and the European powers to prevent a Soviet advance. That's what was NATO's raison d'etre. So after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe, there was no real reason for NATO. I mean, all of us at the time there thought NATO would be mothballed. And all of the policymakers, political leaders, everybody understood that it was foolish to expand NATO beyond the borders of Germany, that it was a needless provocation. What happened was, of course, the war industry, which saw Eastern Europe as a multi-billion-dollar bonanza, because if they could get these countries into the NATO alliance, they would have to make their military equipment compatible with NATO standard, and Soviet standard equipment is different. So they pushed to expand NATO for commercial reasons, not for geopolitical reasons. So that promise, which was made to Gorbachev, was broken. Then as NATO expanded, the Clinton administration promised the Russian leadership that they would not station NATO troops in Eastern Europe. Now we have thousands of NATO troops in Eastern Europe. And there was a de facto kind of recruitment of the Ukraine into NATO because they pumped so many Western weapons systems into the Ukraine. So all of this was predictable. I actually quote in one column I write on this WikiLeaks cable written out of Moscow that even talks about the flashpoint being the Ukraine. So That's why, I take it after Gabriel Garcia Marquez's great novel, Chronicle of the Death Foretold. This was completely predictable if you understood where Russia was coming from. And we can't ignore the fact that much of the Soviet Union was devastated by the Nazi invasion. This was a living historical trauma for the Russians. In the century before, of course, Napoleon had done the same thing. So it was done for commercial interests. It was incredibly irresponsible. It was incredibly foolish. It was unnecessary. I'm not excusing, by the way, the invasion of the Ukraine. Preemptive war is a war crime. They were baited, but they pulled the trigger, and it is their crime. But it was completely preventable, and that's the tragedy.
And I think for the last 6 years or so, the United States has, apart from just NATO expansion, has really been poking the bear, you could say, poking the.
Sure, because you need to create an enemy. I mean, Gorbachev was not much of an enemy. In fact, Gorbachev wanted a regional security agreement. But how do you justify that expansion and those arms sales unless you turn Russia, even the early years of Putin, he really wanted to build a working relationship with Washington and with Europe. But that you need to demonize, you need to create an enemy. And that's essentially what they did. They treated Russia as an enemy, and it certainly was not, and did not want to become an enemy. But they needed that as a justification. I mean, most of these countries, Poland and others, they're taking out tremendous loans in order to buy. Poland just signed a $6 billion deal for M1 Abrams tanks. I mean, I was in Warsaw a couple years ago, and there's billboards all over Warsaw for Raytheon, because Raytheon is just milking the Polish people. So it is highly, highly irresponsible, and has resulted in this war crime and this tragedy.
And we actually just published an article on Mint Press News. It's written by our favorite scholar, Alan MacLeod. He did a study on all of the recent coverage, I would say for the last decade or so, and nearly 90% of all of the opinion pieces that were written in the New York Times, at the Wall Street Journal, and at the Washington Post were all written by figures that worked for weapons manufacturers. Right. And these are the people that are pushing for a Cold War with Russia. And they're clearly being funded by Lockheed Martin, by Raytheon, by Boeing, by General Dynamics. And some of them have, even worked directly with NATO or think tanks that are funded by NATO. So we're talking about a military industrial complex right there, using the media as its official mouthpiece. Now, both of you gentlemen recently, you were working with RT, right? You were working with RT, and recently RT was removed off of the air in the United States. And so, Lee, I want to talk about, your program that was recently removed off the air, Redacted Tonight. I mean, why would people like you turn to an outlet like RT to work at?
Yeah, and I'll get to that in one second. I just want to say, it's not just removed off the air. The entire network shut down, RT America, and everyone was let go, essentially overnight. One day they say everything's running fine. The next day, everything was over, and there were no hints of, hey, we might be back in 2 weeks or a month or a year. It is over. And to me, I don't know if Chris has a different opinion. To me, it seems like it must be connected to U.S. sanctions, because there was no slow down or we'll just go back to RT News or whatever. It was just lights are out. In terms of why I was there, and, I tried to make this clear from day one, 8 years ago. We ultimately did 8 years and 375 episodes. But I was there because I'm anti-war, I'm anti-imperialist, I'm anti-capitalist, and it's the only large-scale network in essentially all of American media, or really all of American entertainment as well, where you can do those type of issues, tackle those type of issues, have those type of talking points. I wrote all of my own words the entire time. I was never told what to say. I was never told to not say anything. I was never censored. And it's just serves as a stark contrast to all of the other networks where we can point to so many people that were canned or pushed out because they came out as anti-war. Phil Donahue was anti-war, the Iraq War, and he would, despite being the #1 show on MSNBC at the time, was kicked out. Jesse Ventura, many people don't know, was going to be a tent pole of MSNBC. They'd already signed the contract, and then they found out he was anti-war in the lead up to Iraq. And he says they paid him upwards of $10 million just to get out of his contract, just to go away, because they didn't want anti-war talking points on their airwaves. And that's every other station. And I realize I'm mentioning news stations, but that's the same with any of these, Comedy Central, NBC. It doesn't matter. There's no place where I could do my comedy show and have the freedom to tackle all these issues in the way I did.
Well, it's really interesting because, we live in the United States and we are a bastion of democracy, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to be. Right. We're supposed to be a bastion of democracy, a bastion of free speech, of First Amendment rights. And actually, under the U.S. Constitution, under our First Amendment, the media is supposed to act as a watchdog to those in power. It's supposed to inform the public so that we, the people, can be better informed citizens. So when we go at the voting polls, we can elect representatives that represent us, but actually it's like completely flipped around. And I'm curious to know, Chris, how did the media become this way now, to the point where, people like us, we have to either start our own media outlets, which, we're dealing with like major censorship and because of algorithm changes and, the conflict of interest between the corporate state and the military industrial complex within social media. And, people like Lee or you have to go work at a foreign media outlet, right? So that you don't get censored and you can actually have editorial freedom. How did we get to this place where our media is a mouthpiece to the neoliberal establishment and the military industrial complex?
Well, the commercial or mainstream media has always been closely allied to the elites. That's not new. I think the difference is that certainly if you go back to the 1960s, there were far more alternative news outlets. And I worked for Bob Scheer's website, ScheerPost. Bob was the editor of Ramparts magazine. And the alternative press, I think like WikiLeaks, has always shamed the traditional press into doing their job. So the first reports of COINTELPRO were in Ramparts. The first time that picture, that iconic photo of the little girl naked running down a road being burned by napalm, that was in Ramparts. The first real investigations into the war were done by marginal news services, My Lai, written by Cy Hirsch. So that's always been the role of the press, the alternative press that is not constrained by commercial power. But it has gotten worse because, especially after Bill Clinton deregulated the FCC, you essentially allowed a handful of corporations to seize control of the airwaves. Print has been decimated because of the internet. 40% of newspaper revenue came from classified ads. Once Craigslist came on, 40% of their revenue disappeared. And then because of the algorithms and the sophistication of the monitoring of social media, they don't need news organizations to connect sellers with buyers. That monopoly that news organizations had is gone. So all of that has seen a deterioration of the press, but I don't want to somehow pretend that the press was, I'm talking about the mainstream press, was ever particularly good. As my friend Sidney Schamberg once said, we may not have made things better. He was pushed out of the New York Times, as was I, by the way. But we often stop things from getting worse. So that's always been an issue. But now I think the other difference I would also add is that because these news outlets, especially on the electronic media, are controlled by huge corporations, they look at that news division as just another revenue stream, and it competes with other revenue streams. And that's how you saw Zucker destroy, not that CNN was ever any good, but turn it into a kind of burlesque. I find it utterly unwatchable. But was all about profits, and he modeled it on ESPN. Everything became their team, our team, and that's also a change in the media landscape, because what instead of having powerful outlets, the old networks, CBS, NBC, trying to reach a wide demographic, you now have media outlets that cater to a particular demographic, which is dangerous because they're feeding that demographic what it wants to hear, but they're also demonizing the opposing demographic. And that Matt Taibbi does a good job of kind of explaining that in his book Hate Inc., where he has Rachel Maddow on one side of the cover and Sean Hannity on the other, because they do the same thing.
And I want to talk about, Lee Camp. You are by far one of the most important political comedians of our time. I would say people get more informed by your show at Redacted Tonight than they do from even several media outlets, independent media outlets. Your shows are usually very jam-packed with information, and the way you present them in this satirical format really kind of gets people's brains going and thinking, and it kind of sticks with them. I mean, I know that I'm one of your biggest fans, and many people at Mint Press that watch or have watched Redacted Tonight would agree with that. I mean, how do you see just the climate of political satire today? I mean, we have the rise of Trevor Noah. Back in the day, we had people like Jon Stewart, but they're still very establishment, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about like the climate of political satire today.
Yeah, I mean, well, there aren't that many that are actually doing kind of cutting political comedy to begin with. As with Bush, there's a lot of comedians who have their 5 minutes of Trump jokes or their 5 minutes of Bush jokes. And to me, that's not a political comedian. That's just, going with the trends of the time to make a little Bush is dumb or Trump is dumb joke. In terms of actually getting it kind of at the deeper issues, there aren't that many of those, and many of them, at the end of the day, they're going to not critique the overall corporate American structure, the overall ruling elite, and how their power works. They're not really going to get to the core of the issue. They're going to go into the exact thing that Chris was just talking about, blue team, red team dynamic, and very few of them, if any of them, get deeper than that. And Trevor Noah is an interesting example because he comes from South Africa, where I remember, wondering, who's replacing Jon Stewart? And in his opening trailer for the new show, he talked about how, it's amazing to be here. I came from, I lived in a house with a hole in the ground instead of a toilet, and now I'm hosting this TV show in America, or something like that. And I knew immediately, I was like, well, if that's your perspective of American, exceptionalism, if you came from poverty and you are now the millionaire in America, then you're not going to critique the ruling elite in a right. cutting manner. And sure enough, he hasn't. It's all surface level analysis that never really gets at the heart of anything. And, sadly, there's so much of political comedy or cultural commentary comedy that's out there is that same stuff. Famously, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, who, by the way, these are all talented comedians. I think Jon Stewart and Colbert and John Oliver, great writers, great comedians. I don't think they're creating any kind of change or really informing people in a useful way, usually. But they famously, Colbert and John Oliver was there too, but Jon Stewart got together and created that Rally for Sanity on the Mall, where they brought like 1 million people. I mean, it was a crazy number of mostly young people out to the mall that could have actually created an impressive amount of, action if it had led them in a correct direction. Here's how we create change. Instead, the overall message of the entire day, which was hours long, was be nice to each other and go home. It was, you just get along. And it just blew my mind, as an activist, as someone who's tried to be parts of movements that really would create change, to see these guys get so many people out to an event and say, hey, don't do anything, go home and be nice. And it was just like, wow, I guess at the end of the day, that's what this is.
We are going to just take a quick 20-second break to jump into our super chat, just to thank everybody for joining us today. And just to remind our listeners too, who are getting, by the way, a lot of positive comments for both Chris and Lee. Thank you, everybody who's joining us right now. Just to reiterate, for those, looks like a lot of people are actually still joining us. So yes, I am Manar Adley, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News, and I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges and political comedian Lee Camp. So please, if you can, if you want to, leave your questions in the comments, and we'll be taking them very soon. I want to talk about the sanctions that have been slapped against Russia, which is most likely the reason why RT America was shut down. I'm just going to go to this really quick. So the sanctions that have taken place against Russia has included removing Russia from SWIFT, Visa and MasterCard to end all of their services in Russia. There was a famous photo showing people stuck at a subway because their cards were not working abruptly. We even have corporations like Starbucks and McDonald's who have shut down hundreds of shops across Russia. But it also appears that the sanctions could also be backfiring now, as Russia is turning to China's Union Pay and turning to China for more services. And so I want to share something here about the Hillary Clinton recently did an interview, I believe it was with Rachel Maddow, and I'm just going to share this clip really quick about the intentions of what the United States would like to see happen because of sanctions. Okay, I don't know if you guys saw this, but I'm going to share it right now. Hold on, where did it go? Oh, here it is. Okay. Oops, it disappeared on us.
That is a possible way out. That is a possible way out. If the Ukrainians, with our help, can impose enough economic pain on
Can you guys hear it or no?
And sadly, the Russian people.
You can hear it?
Combined with providing weapons, that might be the only way that right now I can see us getting to a stalemate that might save the Ukrainian people from even greater tragedy. That is a possible way out.
Okay, I could not hear it, but I have a little transcript here from this is from Anya Parampil's Twitter page.
I can sum it up. She said a possible way out. The possible way out is to create so much pain and suffering that Russia would back down from economic sanctions or something. But yeah, in my opinion, it's disgusting. I mean, to go to a war hawk, a warmonger, a war criminal, and she basically wants the average citizens in Ukraine to try and fight off the Russian military, which is not going to work. And it's just going to elongate this thing, which is what the U.S. wants. The U.S. wants, in my opinion, or what I've seen, wants to use basically Ukrainians as cannon fodder to harm Russia.
Well, and clearly, the fact that we have Hillary Clinton, who's one of the architects of the current crisis that we're seeing today in Ukraine. She's basically saying, like you said, she wants to impose economic pain on Putin. And sadly, she's just saying this part out loud, the Russian people in response to the Ukraine conflict. And so we're seeing now in real time all of the truth coming out about the effects of sanctions. For so long, sanctions have always been sold as a non-violent form to punish a certain person or a corporation or an entity, whatever it may be, for the actions of a government. And people for a long time would support it because they would believe that sanctions wouldn't actually hurt the people. But like we saw in Iraq, where the famous interview of Madeleine Albright, where, you know, she says the price is worth it after she was interviewed about 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of US sanctions. Chris, you have been a war correspondent. You've traveled around the world. I mean, you've seen, I'm assuming, the effects of sanctions, and you probably reported on them as well. What do you foresee that will happen because of these sanctions against Russia?
Well,
and will they backfire? Because I think that's a question people have right now.
right. Well, these sanctions are clearly designed to destroy Putin's government. It's not. That's the goal. That's why they're so draconian. I don't actually oppose sanctions, but what I think frustrates me is that when we carry out preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression, and our war was carried out under lies and fabricated evidence on Iraq, those who are responsible for this criminal activity never pay a price. So, okay, you want to put sanctions on the Russian banks? Well, then there should be sanctions on Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and everyone else. You want to put visa restrictions on political leaders? Fine, but they've got to go on ours. You want to seize the yachts of oligarchs? Bezos has the largest yacht in the world, $500 million it cost. It's like 57 feet longer than a football field. Seize his yacht. I mean, our oligarchs are no less venal than Russian oligarchs. So it's the incredible hypocrisy. And you're never going to create a world based around the rule of law when it's so lopsided. And I wrote a column, about this called "Worthy and Unworthy Victims," taken from Chomsky and Herman's book, Manufacturing Consent. That's what always happens in war. So, I mean, that's my frustration. I think that Putin made a terrible mistake. I think that if he had gone into the separatist regions, and many of the Russian speakers in Ukraine have very legitimate grievances, and he'd stopped, he probably could have made a case. The mistake was trying to take over the country, and the kind of war crimes that become inevitable when you're using industrial weapons in urban centers, no matter who uses them. He hasn't yet done shock and awe like we did, 3,000 bombs, and I don't know, I can't remember, how long, but 7,000 dead in 2 months. He hasn't done that yet. But as he becomes frustrated, he will. That's inevitably what happens in war. So I was opposed to the Iraqi sanctions because the sanctions blocked medical supplies. I mean, they blocked things like that people, and you would go into hospitals in Iraq and people didn't have even basic medicine or drugs or anesthesia or anything else. That was just criminal. So I think sanctions against banks or sanctions. I mean, one of the sanctions that was imposed on Iraq that did work was blocking spare parts for the Iraq military. But that made the war even more criminal because most of Saddam Hussein's equipment didn't even work because of the sanctions. So, yeah.
And we're seeing that actually in Venezuela. I mean, I just traveled to Venezuela, and half of their mining equipment doesn't even, not even half, most of it doesn't even work properly because.
Well, I would say that raising the price of oil is pretty good for Venezuela. So.
Yeah, I mean,
I think they're finally digging themselves out of it.
Well, the U.S. U.S. just sent a delegation down there to meet with Maduro to try and get Venezuelan oil, which is hilarious considering supposedly Maduro's not the president, according to the U.S. government.
I think they said they're not going to sell them any.
Well, and I think this is a big question that people have is, are these sanctions going to backfire? Because we're kind of seeing we're kind of starting to see that kind of narrative, at least coming from the Russian side. And so what do you guys think about this? I mean, either one of you could answer this question.
I wanted to say they're not judicious. They're clearly designed to destroy Putin, and that's dangerous. So they should have been more judicious. I'm certain RT was taken down. But they've long wanted to take down RT.
Yeah.
You go back to the 2017 Director of National Intelligence report, and there's about 7 pages in there on RT. And they're not whining about Russian propaganda. They're complaining that RT gives a voice to Black Lives Matter activists and third-party candidates and anti-fracking activists and this kind of stuff. And I think that the anger, and I watched Clapper's testimony, and it's not just his words, but his rage, is because we're calling out these elites for their hypocrisy, their cynicism, their mendacity, their corruption. That's why. This gave the deep state the excuse to shut it down. It's kind of ridiculous because RT had a very tiny media footprint. It's not like we were reaching particularly large numbers of the American public. But that's first of all, since Prop or Not, this was the anonymous website that charged left-wing sites. Maybe Mint News was on it. With being Russian propaganda. This is crazy. And then we all got hit with algorithms. So the IT people at TruthDig, where I was before we all went on strike and got fired, ran a graph on referrals from impressions. So that means that if you went to Google and you typed in imperialism, and I'd written something on imperialism recently, it would come up with anything else. And those referrals dropped in a 12-month period from over 700,000 to below 200,000. And then Lee will tell you, I mean, my average, sometimes it was higher, but my average viewership on YouTube was like 40 or 50,000 a show. That got cut in half with the algorithms.
I think everybody on the left and from the anti-war movement felt that, including Mint Press. I mean, we used to be at the top of Google News when you'd search anything about Syria, Libya, NATO, just like you said. Now we're on page 3.
So I mean, this is part of a process, and they're not going to stop with RT.
Right.
They're not.
Yeah, they've definitely not stopped with RT, and I see this as a couple of decades long path where the internet eventually got fast enough and in every home, and the social media platforms got good enough that information could be shared very quickly. And there was this sweet spot, but to make up years between about 2010 and 2015 or something, where these ideas, anti-imperialist ideas, anti-war, etc., could be shared quickly and easily, and created large-scale movements like Occupy and like Bernie Sanders movement and Arab Spring and all these things. And the ruling elite realized the messaging was getting out of control. They lost control of it, and now they've spent 5 years kind of crushing it all back down, deleting pages, suppressing the algorithms in a very large way, often cross-platform censorship. In the span of 3 days last week, I lost my TV show. All the redacted night clips are banned in Europe and UK, and my podcast was deleted from Spotify. And, in the past, we've seen Facebook purged 800 pages in one day, including things like Free Thought Project, Police the Police, antiwar.com, etc. And instantaneously, the editors' Twitters were suspended at the same time, meaning there had to be coordination between Facebook and Twitter, who are supposedly enemies or rivals, coordination to do such a thing. So, yeah, the very large-scale suppression that's been going on for several years to try and regain control of the messaging.
And I just want to say that, there's a collaboration with traditional media outlets. So it's not just blocking or marginalizing alternative viewpoints. It's funneling people back into the arms of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, with this, supposed, because they're supposedly reputable and fair and objective. And, I'm sure, Manar, you heard what was that podcast called, with the guy who was a complete fraud at the time?
Alex Jones?
Caliphate, was it called? No, they did a 10-part series with somebody who was like supposedly part of ISIS and like crucifying.
Oh, yeah. It was part of the New York Times, but I don't remember the name. Yeah.
Podcast. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, is that Abdul something? I forgot his name.
Yeah, I don't remember his name, but
I don't remember his name. But I think I know who you're talking about.
right. So I mean, it was a complete hoax.
Yeah.
Russiagate. I mean, there you go. 2 years of that. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So, the idea that somehow these large media institutions are not capable of disseminating misinformation just is not borne out by the facts. And so, yeah, there is a kind of really a dirty marriage now between the censors in Silicon Valley and the traditional media outlets, who I think are also threatened in a way. That's why they're going after Julian Assange. I mean, they were threatened by WikiLeaks. They had to publish the material, because if they didn't, they would have been exposed for who they are. But as soon as they did publish that material, they all colluded in going after, demonizing Julian, the very media organizations that had used his material. So I think we're watching the walls close in. I think it's very frightening, especially as the ruling elites have less and less credibility. Nobody is addressing the very real suffering on the part of the working class and the working poor. In fact, things, of course, are getting worse, not just with inflation, but with severance of those few programs that kind of kept people going, child tax credits, supplementing welfare payments, moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, moratorium on student loan payments. So as things deteriorate, as the oligarchy consolidates ever more wealth to itself, and we've never seen anything like this in American history. I mean, when I think David Rockefeller died, he was worth about $3 billion. Even the worst kleptocrats, Ferdinand and Melda Marcos, they stole, I think, about 10 billion. And I mean, we now have figures like Elon Musk and Bezos over $180 million. I mean, this is insane. And that kind of consolidation by the wealth, the inability on the system now to check it in any way and respond to the real needs of the American public, means that this kind of censorship will become more present and wider.
And I agree with you that it does feel like the walls are closing in, because now our access to information, it just feels so bleak. I mean, they're cracking down on everything, and a lot of times, the thing that they're cracking down on, that they're referring to as misinformation, like in a couple of years, that kind of information comes out and it turns out to be true because of FOIA requests or something like that. And we've seen that taking place. I mean, even with the war in Syria. I mean, Mint Press was one of the first independent small media organizations that reported on how Al-Qaeda was being split, and ISIS was moving into Syria, and their agenda to create this caliphate. And I remember at that time we were reporting on how U.S. weapons were basically landing in their hands, and they were acting as a proxy for U.S. interests in the region.
We were arming the moderate rebels. I've been in war.
Exactly. And so
hard saying I'm moderate. I mean, it's insane. Well, of course, Al Qaeda, which was getting shellacked in Iraq, crossed the border as fast as they could, and truckloads of weapons were handed. It was the most ridiculous policy, aside from the criminal nature of it. And so you had, I mean, just the whole. You look at the whole 20-year period, it was completely upended. I mean, so at one point, Hezbollah forces were, of course, fighting for the Syrians, and then we decided we had to go after the caliphate. So we were really literally working as Hezbollah's air force. I mean, it just was nuts, and none of it makes any sense. It was total chaos, but it did what it was designed to do, which is make these weapons companies rich. And of course, once the war in the Ukraine started, their stocks, which had taken a hit after they left Afghanistan, and they were publicly complaining about it, shot upwards again. And if we're not going to go to war with Russia, then they'll stoke the tension with China. I mean, it's just and at this point, the political class is so beholden to these incredibly wealthy corporations that they'll be rolled over. I mean, any sane politician or diplomat would have never expanded NATO ever. And those of us who were there in '89, it didn't even occur to us that they would. It didn't make any sense. Well, of course, it doesn't make any sense unless you're trying to make money.
Right. And I just want to remind everybody who are watching us today, we are taking super chats. So if you want to add your comments, if you want to add your questions, we'll be taking them at the very end of this live stream. And we really appreciate everybody who has joined us today. And I just want to remind everyone too that Mint Press has featured live streams and podcasts on this subject where we've had people with differing opinions and analysis on the situation. And we welcome that on our platform because, you know, we want to encourage healthy dialogue and analysis about this subject matter. And so I just want to share the screen right now about an article that was published on our website a few years ago. You know, we just want to talk about moderate rules here. This article was published on our website in 2018. It was written by Max Blumenthal, and he basically chronicled and, you know, investigated how the United States was arming Nazis in Ukraine after the Maidan uprising there, and how this is actually a huge blowback. I mean, the article is titled Blowback, an inside look at how US funded fascists in Ukraine will be, you know, are mentoring US white supremacists at home. So not only are white supremacists from across the West flocking to Ukraine to learn from the combat experience of their fascist brothers in arms, they are doing so openly under the nose of a shrugging law enforcement, chronicling their experiences on social media before they bring their lessons back home. And so we're kind of seeing the same playbook play out here in Ukraine, where the United States, after the 2014 Maidan coup that was, you know, orchestrated by people like Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden himself, and under the Obama administration, the United States basically began sending arms to Nazis like the Azov battalion inside Ukraine. And so this is almost like we're seeing the same playbook take place from what we saw in Syria, what we saw in Libya, where the United States, you know, directly armed groups indirectly and directly from Al-Nusra Front, which at one point Al-Nusra Front was an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. I mean, it still is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but at one point it was designated as a terror organization by the US State Department. And politicians that wanted to overthrow the Assad government were basically saying that they wanted to remove Al-Nusra Front from the terror watch list. Okay, these are people that like are famous for blowing themselves up, for cutting people's heads off, for pushing a Wahhabi Salafist, you know, political ideology onto the people as their version of Islam. And so now we're seeing this take place in Ukraine. I mean, Lee, you've been covering this kind of stuff for a long time. I mean, can you compare like media coverage that you've seen when it comes to like the wars in Syria to now the war in Ukraine, where these neo-Nazis are now being whitewashed by our media?
And not just Syria, but, you know, recall the New York Times front page with Osama bin Laden on it from the 1980s, the freedom fighter Osama bin Laden. Yeah, this is an old strategy that always works great for us. You know, funding and arming radical, insane, not this time Nazis. Just the other day, PBS did an interview with the mayor of one of the cities, and behind him was a framed portrait of a well-known Nazi. And so they blurted out because they didn't want people to realize that they were basically doing a hero piece on a Nazi-affiliated mayor, to put it lightly. But yeah, these things always have blowback, and they always are catastrophic, except it depends on how cynical you want to be. The U.S. wants to create failed states. Right now, they want Ukraine to be a failed state that Russia endlessly has to deal with and is bogged down economically and otherwise for a long time. They don't want peace tomorrow. They want this to continue. And, they wanted Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria to largely become failed states or at least U.S. or furthermore U.S.-run states. But I guess failed states will do the trick. And so, yes, there is blowback, but in many ways, these military industrial complex goons who come up with these plans get what they want. They get states that are not a threat largely to U.S. military power, and sometimes they fully get a U.S. puppet government in there. But yeah, yes, there's blowback, but often this awful technique works in a certain sense. Of course, that is if you don't care at all about innocent civilians or people getting killed left and right.
I want to share another article here. I was just telling Chris about this before we went live. It's actually from the Atlantic Council, and this is the most ridiculous, piece of propaganda that I have seen in a very long. I mean, obviously we're surrounded by propaganda every single day, but this just takes things to the next level here. We have an article from the Atlantic Council. We have to remember the Atlantic Council is funded by NATO. It's funded by Israel. It's funded by Saudi Arabia. It's funded by a lot of Democratic political leaders, tied to Hillary Clinton. And so it's very much a neoliberal think tank that promotes war. It works in partnership with Facebook to crack down on so-called fake news. And they recently, just February 24th, you can see the date right here, February 24th from 2020. This was, just like a year or a year and a half before, or almost 2 years, I guess I should say, before the United States provoked this current crisis in Ukraine. They're arguing why Azov, the Nazi battalion, should not be designated a foreign terrorist organization. And they just go on to talk about how this is basically a paramilitary unit as part of the Special Operations Detachment, as part of the National Guard in Ukraine. And so I think everybody should just check this out more for just, informing themselves and just seeing kind of the way that these think tanks portray certain terror groups. And I just want to share one more really quick. Where did it go? This is a video. Where is my video? I think we lost the video. It's a video of Azov. I think I lost the video, but I think everybody has probably seen it. I can't find it. I think I accidentally clicked out of it, but it's a video that went viral. It was from the National Guard's Ukraine's official National Guard Twitter page of these Azov battalion fighters that are part of the National Guard. This was just like a week and a half ago. They're dipping their bullets in pork fat. And in the video, they're saying how they're getting ready to fight Muslims. And so it was a very Islamophobic video, but it just portrayed the kind of thinking that's behind this people. And should we really be surprised that the United States is now supporting this white supremacist kind of establishment in Ukraine when we saw the media in the way that it has completely dehumanized the victims of U.S. wars for the last, several decades, because they're brown, because they're Muslim. When we saw the famous clips of the famous CBS reporter who said that, we would never hope that this would happen in Ukraine because, they're European, right? And so, Chris, I mean, I know that you have a lot of experience covering war. I mean, how are you seeing racism right now play in this whole crisis and conflict?
Well, the flip side of nationalism is always racism. So look at the wars in the Middle East. The racism was rampant, especially if you were with soldiers and Marines, as I was. They would call Iraqis or anyone in the Middle East, the sand, and ragheads, and haji, which is a term of respect in Arabic, but they would use it as a derogatory term. So racism is always, you dehumanize the opponent. It's easier to do when they're not white. And I think we are seeing a great deal of racism in terms of the outpouring of empathy. I mean, what about Yemen? I mean, Yemenis are enduring hell on earth that certainly probably more than rivals what Ukrainians are enduring. I don't want to take away in any way the suffering of the Ukrainians. What about Palestinians? What about their heroic resistance? So the hypocrisy is, especially if you live, as I did, 20 years overseas, just flagrant. In terms of fascism, we, as soon as the minute World War II was over, we embraced the SS and the fascists. I mean, Reinhard Gehlen, who had been the Wehrmacht's Foreign Armies East military intelligence chief, was immediately recruited by the CIA, and he was a founding member of the Federal Intelligence Service of West Germany during the Cold War. He brought in hundreds of Nazis. I mean, a lot of the people who made it through the rat line, including Klaus Barbie. I lived in Cochabamba, Bolivia. He was known as Klaus Altmann, but we all knew who he was. I used to see him with his bodyguards and think, oh my God, that's the guy who tortured to death Jean Moulin. He was funneled out because of his services to the U.S. And the United States set up a series of black sites, many of them in Europe, in the hysteria of the Cold War and communism, where all sorts of dissidents and labor leaders were tortured and killed. And this was the active participation of former SS and Nazis. So that there is a kind of natural affinity for neo-Nazi groups in the Ukraine shouldn't be any surprise. We have a long history of embracing fascists.
We're going to be taking some questions from the super chat right now. And so I'm going to read out a couple of questions, and we can see where we can go so that we can wrap up the discussion here. And I really appreciate both of you for giving and providing us with your insight. So I think one of the biggest questions on people's minds right now is, are there any predictions on potential geopolitical realignment on a global scale? Does cutting off the EU from Russian energy give the US what they need to stay on top?
You can't talk about war if you don't talk about markets. And the U.S. they're salivating at the thought of forcing the Europeans to buy their quote unquote natural gas, which the Europeans don't want to do because it's a lot more expensive than Russian natural gas. So yes, of course, that's a huge impetus. And the thing that disturbs me the most is pumping in hundreds of millions of dollars of weaponry to the Ukraine. So and this has happened in Georgia, and they're not going to fight on behalf of the Ukrainians, but they will, arm the Ukrainians so that and create piles of corpses. Well, this makes any kind of ceasefire or diplomatic solution extremely difficult. And so you go back and look at what the CIA did with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I mean, in many ways, they lured the Soviets into Afghanistan, and then we created the Taliban. We funded Osama bin Laden. Of course, it's a very similar kind of technique to create a constant war, failed state, as you mentioned, force Russia to bleed and pay for it with Ukrainian lives. One of my gut reaction watching this is I also have a great deal of anger, I suppose, at the Ukrainian government for handing out weapons to people who don't know how to use them. That's just setting them up to be slaughtered. I covered the war in Kosovo. I was in northern Albania with the Kosovo Liberation Army. Had all these Albanian kids coming in from where they worked as like cooks or something in Munich, and they give them an AK-47. They give them like 2 days of cursory training, and then send them over the mountains. I went with them, 600 of them. And they were just wiped out by the Serbs, who were a professional military unit. So, that bothers me. That's irresponsible. Telling mothers to make Molotov cocktails. I mean, they love to play that on the media because it's kind of dramatic and heroic, but I don't like it. So I worry that the goal of the West is to perpetuate a kind of military quagmire. They don't care what the cost to the Ukrainians is going to be.
Well,
Yeah.
isn't that what we do best? I mean, look at what happened in Libya. I mean, it turned into a failed state after the US and NATO overthrew the Gaddafi government, and Syria was devastated. Yemen is just, I mean, it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It's just such a horrible, horrible state. I mean, that to me seems like the good old fashioned divide and conquer, fragment, and balkanize, and just keep people pitted against each other and flood countries with weapons. We saw that in Sudan. We saw that in so many countries, as you know. I mean, it just seems like that is the goal. That's what they want to happen.
And I think it's what they want to happen. And I think in the larger sense, the U.S. is a waning empire. We're in late stage capitalism. Yeah. We're up against a greatly gaining economic system in China connected to Russia. And so we need to find these things to separate the world, because otherwise we lose our global empire, which, of course, in a rational acting state would be okay. You just decrease your military bases around the world, decrease your economy. But no, of course, that's unthinkable. It's about continuing to maintain global supremacy. And this is useful to the U.S. right now, and they're hoping to, like Chris said, it's going to be Ukrainian people used as cannon fodder to just give Russia a quagmire there. And I do think there could be some unintended consequences of all these sanctions, economic war. There's some, like former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, when I talked to him, said that once Russia cuts off the oil spigot to Europe, even though the U.S. will offer some, it's going to just have crazy ramifications, that their economies are going to tank across Europe. And it's, who knows what the consequences long term of that can be. There's going to be a lot of ramifications to this, and the U.S. doesn't seem to be thinking beyond just, we want to have a war on Russia's border that they have to deal with.
Well, it seems like there's a larger agenda here, like both of you have alluded to. This is a tweet from Benjamin Norton. He interviews economist Michael Hudson all the time, who I follow and read some of his work. And he has long argued, according to this tweet here, that the U.S. war on Russia was actually a U.S. war on Europe to keep the EU subordinated to U.S. capital. And I think, Chris, you said it best, like we're seeing late stage capitalism. It's a dying empire, and the U.S. is doing whatever it can. It's like a toddler on a tantrum. I have a 4-year-old. When he goes on a tantrum, he'll get whatever he wants, and that's kind of what it seems like. We're seeing right now, a very dangerous toddler, of course, with weapons and with nuclear weapons. So that's what it really seems like is happening, is that we're just kind of, these are our last resort efforts to keep ourselves alive and moving forward. And it's at the cost of people's lives overseas. And of course, this is going to, and that's why there's such an aggressive, I definitely would call it aggressive effort to control the narrative. And that's why we're seeing such a fog of war. We're seeing social media tech giants cracking down on, so-called misinformation. And obviously that's just a guise to crack down on any sort of alternative information, any information that challenges the status quo. Let's see here. We have another question that we're going to answer here from our viewers that have joined us. Chris and Lee, so either one of you guys can answer this. Can you tell us about the recent revelations about the biological weapons and research facilities found in Ukraine? Now that we have Victoria Nuland basically admitting that for what they called as fake news and Russian propaganda for so long, now we have Victoria Nuland famously admitting. And if you guys don't mind, can I play her clip of her admitting that? Do you guys mind?
Sure.
Okay, I have it right here. 1 second. I'm gonna just pull it up. So bear with me here for just 1 second. Oops, that's not working. So I'm just going to scroll down to this other one. Here it is. We're going to share the screen. Bear with me. I'm always slow when I want to share my screen. So let's see here. Here it is. So before we answer this question, here's Victoria Nuland basically admitting, and just to point this out, Diliana Gaitsiva, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, so please excuse me, but she is the founder of Arms Watch, and she's a very well researched journalist who was smeared for like over 6 years for basically reporting on this, Pentagon-funded bioweapons program in Ukraine and in 25 other countries. So here's the video.
So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those
you guys can hear it, right?
research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
So there we have it, straight from Victoria Nuland's mouth there. And either one of you can answer that question about.
I know they exist, but I don't know anything beyond that.
Right now the United States is warning that Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine, and they would come, I believe they said, from this biolab, right? Is that what we're reading?
Well,
Chris,
either way, this could be the same kind of false flag we saw with the Syria chemical weapons, which 4 OPCW whistleblowers have now come forward and said their reports were changed. And you just announced, Syria, that'll be a red line if Syria uses chemical weapons. Oh, here's a photo of a chemical weapon on the ground. It was clearly them, and then you can do what you want. And it seems, maybe the U.S. is trying to set up that same garbage.
I'm very reticent. Having covered war for so long, I don't believe any side because disinformation is a crucial component of war. Everyone does it. The Russians do it. We do it. So I really came to a point where if I didn't see it, I don't believe it. And I'm sure that this story is not quite as cut and dry as Victoria Nuland, who has a pretty dirty track record. Is making it.
So I believe the revelations, though, were also revealed from the Pentagon's website. And there's another interview where Diliana is actually interviewing a member of the EU, where they said that that these labs do exist, but they wouldn't admit what was being researched.
I think it is documented the labs exist, and I think that's fascinating and terrifying. But going beyond there as to, is Putin going to use them or that gets kind of murky. And so, every statement now about Russia is designed not to impart truth, but to foster fear and to demonize Putin. Everything they say has only those two goals. Whether it's true or not to them is irrelevant.
Okay, we're going to take just 2 more questions, and we'll try to keep this as brief as possible. And again, we really appreciate everybody sending us these questions. And just a reminder that you can support our work by becoming a member on our Patreon, and we always appreciate, of course, tips while we're doing the live streams. So we're going to take this question. It's after the dust settles from self-inflicted economic disaster, Will the EU survive and stay intact, or do you think there will be any sort of balkanization and any sort of independence from the US?
I would say the danger is SWIFT. I mean, so they're pushing Russia out of SWIFT. Russia's economy is not that big, by the way. It's quite small. It's both, and its military, by the way, isn't very big either compared to the U.S. So, but the interesting thing for me is how self-defeating it is to block countries. You already have Iran, Cuba, and if enough in this kind of multipolar world, allied with China, can sever themselves from SWIFT, which is the international money exchange system, which uses the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, that is the death blow to the American empire, as we saw when the pound sterling, which was the reserve currency, was dropped in the 1950s. Then not only does the dollar decline by, who knows, half, 2/3, I mean, a lot, but people don't want to buy our treasury bonds. In short, they don't want to buy our debt. And we funded all these wars through debt. We fund the government through debt. And that's what's interesting. By pressuring, putting more pressure, and Putin and the Russians have already tried as much as possible to distance themselves from SWIFT, but cutting them off from SWIFT, of course, makes that even more dramatic. So I think that's very interesting. Alfred McCoy has written quite a bit on this. And that's what interests me. So it may be very self-defeating, ultimately, on the part of the United States. What will it do to Europe? Well, I think you raised it. I mean, if oil prices go through the roof, of course, there's going to be a massive economic slowdown, which will have political consequences in that will further strengthen the proto-fascists in not only in countries like Poland and Hungary, but you have proto-fascist movements in France, Le Pen, and Germany, and everywhere else.
So I want to wrap up with just one final question. And this is about independent media. We have people, actually multiple people have asked in the super chat, what is the future of independent anti-war journalism? Why are all the journalists working alone instead of collaborating with each other and building an anti-war platform? Lee, did you want to talk about that? What do you think? What do you think the future is?
The future of anti-war journalism, I'm going to start using smoke signals. And since all my platforms have been deleted or suppressed, I'm going to just do my show out on the sidewalk with a tin can. So I think that might be the future for me. No, I did create a patreon.com/LeeCamp to try and keep something going. But in terms of why aren't they working together? I mean, there are some efforts to work together. I and Eleanor Goldfield created radindymedia.com, which is not a money-making site. There's no sponsors. There's no ads. It just takes together, aggregates a bunch of great independent media. Mint Press is on there all the time. Chris Hedges is on there all the time. And it links directly to their sites and their videos, so it's not stealing any of their clicks. And the goal was kind of twofold. One is that people could have this great morning digital newspaper that has all of the best independent media from the day before or earlier. And the reason number two was if any of these journalists get suppressed or get their platforms deleted, there will still be a place that you can go and find all of their work. Now, when I was working to create it, I didn't think it'd be me, but here we are. So yeah, I do try and work together, but I agree there should be a wonderful new and amazing anti-war platform that Manar, you're going to create any minute.
Well, I mean, Bob Scheer, when we all had to leave Truthdig, which was funded by an heiress who turned against us, not a surprise when we tried to unionize. Now Bob is running ScheerPost, but he didn't have any money. What I'm doing is working now to set up a Substack account, which hopefully, with enough subscribers, will allow me to continue what I've been doing, which is to write a weekly column for ScheerPost and produce a show, continue to produce a show. The show that I did on RT used to be on Telesource, so I would like to continue it. But there are less and less models now for independent journalism. And you see all these calls to shut down Substack. which is probably next. So, I mean, I can, it's kind of this creeping censorship, and, we battle back as best we can, and we try, with each blow to find a way to sustain our work and its integrity. But it's certainly becoming more and more difficult, and it's frightening. And I think that, as I said earlier, that the goal is really to essentially shut most of us down. I mean, just the fact that I support BDS, which I do very strongly, I spent a lot of time in Gaza alone. That single issue alone. That's why
you were censored before because of that support, right?
All sorts of. I mean, invitation to speak at the University of Pennsylvania, they rescinded it. Well, because all the Hillel houses are just outposts of AIPAC. And I mean, Oberlin, all sorts of colleges, and they tar you with being an anti-Semite, which of course I'm not. But it's vicious. And but to take any kind of a stand like that, and that's why Cornell West was pushed out of Harvard.
Yeah.
Why they would not give him tenure, because he also supports BDS. So, yeah, the walls are closing in. We're doing the best we can. For now, for me, the model will be Substack. I don't need a lot of people to pay $6 a month, but if I can get enough, then I'll continue until they shut Substack down. And then I'm just hoping Lee has a big house and a big come with my 2 greyhounds, my kids.
Yeah.
So, well, and obviously for those watching, you obviously know about Mint Press News. We're a great platform to be following as well. And we work with a lot of independent journalists. And I'm actually, in the past year and a half, I have built another platform that is still kind of being built slowly but surely, called Behind the Headlines. I've been working with people like the Media Freedom Foundation, Project Censored, former FBI whistleblower Colleen Rowley, human rights lawyer Todd Pierce. They're on our board. I think I asked you, Chris Hedges, to be an advisor. I think you might have declined.
I don't be on boards, because then somebody takes some position that
I know. I totally,
I don't.
I totally get that. So we've built another platform that we are making 100% people funded, and that's where independent journalism has to be. I mean, we can't. I mean, the fact that we have the most, the most brilliant, most amazing, most talented journalists, having to work at an international, foreign governments funded. I'm like having a hard time explaining it. Foreign government funded outlet, so that they can have editorial freedom, says a lot about the state of media in our country. And so we have to take the power back in our hands.
So when I covered, I knew Václav Havel. I covered the revolution in Czechoslovakia. When you wanted to hear Havel, you'd turn on Voice of America in Czechoslovakia.
Right.
He was no friend of U.S. imperialism. He was a socialist. But that was the only option he had. And, for people like Lee and I and others, we've been really effectively marginalized. I mean, and so that's why we were where we are, and we'll keep doing what we do as long as we can.
Absolutely. And, as we build this it's a video project platform called Behind the Headlines. And as we build that, we hope that we set the example of what a truly anti-war watchdog journalism outlet is. And of course, the biggest challenge with building a nonprofit is that you do have a board that is hopefully supposed to keep the organization in check. But like you said, Chris, the challenge is, what if your board turns into like Democracy Now!'s board? Or the Nation's board, or Mother Jones's board? Then you've got a real problem, because the organization as a whole could take a completely different turn. But we're going to make sure that doesn't
turn around and destroy the very organizations they're supposed to oversee.
That's absolutely correct. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners who joined us and joined our super chat, and for those who tipped us and donated. Very much appreciated from the bottom of my heart. We're going to wrap this up for today. You can follow both of their work. Lee, where can we find your work now?
Patreon.com/Lee Camp. I hope everyone will check it out.
Okay, and what about you, Chris?
I'm still on SheerPost, and if we can, I'm still working with Substack. If I can set that up, then I don't know how to do Substack. I guess Chris Hedges Substack or something, but it's not up yet.
Okay, and we republish both of your work, so
Yeah.
people can also follow your work
And
on
that's
Mint
true.
Press News.
Yep.
Absolutely. So very much appreciate your insight today, and thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks
Thanks a lot.